Imagine an enemy that becomes twice as strong every time you strike it down. An enemy where every victory is actually a devastating defeat. This isn't a riddle. It's a biological nightmare. A creature that defies the very laws of life and death. An unsolvable problem made of flesh and venom. For every head you sever, two more erupt from the wound, more violent, more hateful than the last. You can't fight it. You can't wound it. You can't kill it. The more you try, the more of it there is. So how do you defeat a monster that feeds on its own destruction? This was the question facing the greatest hero the world has ever known, as he stood at the edge of a poisoned swamp, staring into the abyss of his second, and perhaps most impossible labor. This is the story of the Lernaean Hydra. In the ancient world, long before empires rose and fell, there were pockets of darkness that civilization dared not touch. Places where the old gods' failed experiments festered. The swamps of Lerna, near the shimmering coast of the Argolic Gulf, was one such place. It was a realm of decay, of stagnant water and fetid air that clung to the lungs. The locals whispered of a curse, a blight upon the land that poisoned their water and sickened their livestock. They spoke of a guardian at the entrance to the underworld, a creature so vile that its very breath was a lethal vapor, its blood a searing acid that could dissolve flesh and bone. This was no mere beast. It was a plague given monstrous form. This creature was Typhon's daughter, sister to Cerberus, the three-headed hound of hell. She was born of primordial chaos and divine hatred, a serpent of immense size with a multitude of heads, each one armed with fangs that dripped a venom so potent, it was said to be the source of all poison in the world. This was the Hydra, and it was a living embodiment of an unwinnable war. Into this heart of darkness walked a man who was half god, half mortal, and all legend. Hercules, known to the Romans as Hercules. He was on a divine quest of penance, 12 labors designed by his nemesis, the goddess Hera, to be utterly impossible. He had already slain the Nemean lion, a beast whose hide was impervious to any weapon. He had faced the impossible and won. But the lion was a straightforward problem of strength. The Hydra was a paradox. Hercules was not alone. By his side was his loyal nephew, Iolaus, a young man whose courage was perhaps greater than his wisdom, driving the chariot that carried the hero to the edge of the swamp. Hercules, cloaked in the hide of the Nemean lion, took a deep breath, covering his mouth and nose with a cloth to protect himself from the creature's toxic breath. He knew that to face this monster in its lair was suicide. It had to be drawn out. With a volley of flaming arrows, he fired into the darkness of the Hydra's den, a cave beneath a gnarled plane tree that drank from the poisoned waters of the spring anemone. The arrows hissed as they flew, their light cutting through the gloom, until they struck their target. A roar echoed from the cave, a sound that wasn't of one creature but of a legion. The ground trembled as the beast emerged. It was more horrifying than any story could describe. A colossal serpentine body, thick as an ancient oak, slithered from the darkness. And from its torso erupted not one, not two, but 9 heads, each on a long flexible neck, weaving through the air like a nest of vipers. Their reptilian eyes, cold and ancient, fixed on Hercules. Their forked tongues tasted the air, and a collective hiss filled the swamp, a sound that promised a painful, agonizing death. Hercules was the son of Zeus. Strength was his birthright. His instincts screamed for him to attack, to crush, to overwhelm. He drew his massive bronze sword, a gift from the gods, and charged. The Hydra's heads lunged, striking like lightning. He dodged and weaved, the lion's skin cloak deflecting a glancing blow that would have killed any other man. He saw his opening. With a mighty roar that shook the trees, he swung his blade in a great arc, severing one of the serpent's heads clean from its neck. For a heartbeat there was a moment of triumph. Black, toxic blood sprayed from the stump, and the headless neck writhed in agony. Hercules prepared to strike again. But then the horror began. From the gushing wound, the flesh began to bubble and twist. It tore open, and not one, but 2 new heads erupted from the mangled stump, fully formed, hissing with renewed fury. They were smaller, but no less venomous, their eyes burning with a fresh, raw hatred. Hercules froze. The stories were true. Iolaus, watching from the chariot, cried out in despair. The hero had not wounded the beast. He had made it stronger. He had taken a 9-headed monster and, with a single blow, turned it into a 10-headed one. Panic was a luxury he could not afford. Gritting his teeth, he swung again, a desperate, powerful blow that took off two heads at once. A geyser of black blood erupted, and from the twin wounds, the grotesque miracle repeated itself. For new heads burst forth, writhing and snapping, their collective hiss growing into a deafening roar. He had started with 9 heads. Now he faced 12. His strength, the very gift that defined him, was now his greatest liability. Every swing of his sword, every act of aggression, was feeding the monster, multiplying his enemy. He was like a man trying to put out a fire with gasoline. He stepped back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind racing. The writhing mass of heads pressed forward, a living wall of fangs and venom driving him back. The air was thick with the stench of poison. The ground was slick with the creature's acidic blood, burning the very soil it touched. He was the strongest man on earth, a demigod destined for greatness, and he was being overwhelmed. He was losing. For the first time, Hercules was facing an enemy that his power could not conquer. The Hydra was not just a monster of flesh and bone. It was a concept, a living equation of exponential growth. And as this terrifying realization dawned on him, he noticed something even more horrifying. Amidst the chaos of the thrashing, regenerating heads, one of them was different. The head at the very center of the mass did not lunge or hiss with the same mindless fury as the others. It watched him with a cold, ancient intelligence. It was larger, its scales shimmering with a faint, sickly golden light. This was the one thing the stories had warned him about, the final cruel twist of the knife in this impossible task. While the other heads could be destroyed and would regrow, this central head, this one was immortal, could not be killed. Hercules stood, sword in hand, surrounded by an enemy that grew stronger with every attack, an enemy that possessed a core that could never be destroyed. His brute force had failed. His courage was faltering. He was facing a biological paradox, a living, breathing nightmare, and he had absolutely no idea how to stop it. For a moment, there was only the sound of his own ragged breath and the triumphant hissing of the creature before him. The swamp, once just a backdrop for a heroic deed, had become his personal hell. Every swing of his mighty arm, every ounce of strength he poured into the fight, had only made his enemy stronger. He was creating the very monster that was defeating him. It was a feedback loop of failure, each action amplifying the futility of the next. This wasn't a battle of strength against strength. It was a battle of one man's finite power against a monster's infinite potential. And in that kind of war, there is only ever one winner. From the relative safety of the chariot, his nephew Iolaus watched in horror. He saw not the demigod, the celebrated hero, but his uncle, a man pushed to the brink of despair. He saw the slight hesitation before each swing, the growing disbelief in his eyes. Iolaus was no Hercules. He didn't possess the strength to shatter mountains or wrestle gods. His weapon was his mind. While Hercules was lost in the chaotic dance of combat, Iolaus was outside of it, observing, analyzing. He wasn't focused on the thrashing heads or the snapping jaws. He was watching the necks. He saw the gruesome stumps left by Hercules' blade. He saw the geyser of black, venomous blood. But then he saw something else. In the split second before 2 new heads erupted, the flesh at the wound would bubble and writhe, seething with a furious, unnatural energy. It was like watching life itself on fast forward, a grotesque parody of healing. The tissue didn't just mend. It exploded outward, fueled by the very air, by the very essence of the swamp. It wasn't a magical curse he was witnessing. It was a biological process, a terrifyingly efficient form of regeneration, and a process he realized could be interrupted. What stops growth? What stops life in its tracks? Fire, the great purifier, the element that consumes and sterilizes, that turns living tissue into inert ash. An idea, desperate and brilliant, sparked in his mind. He shouted to Hercules, his voice cutting through the cacophony of hisses and roars. He yelled of his observation of the bubbling flesh, of the need for a new weapon, not to cut but to seal. Hercules, weary and blood-spattered, heard the words but could barely process them. Fire. How could fire help against a beast of this magnitude? But he looked at the ever-growing thicket of serpentine heads, a writhing monument to his failure, and he knew his own way was not working. He had to trust. He had to change. In that moment, the greatest hero in Greece had to do the hardest thing he had ever done. Admit he couldn't do it alone. With a roar of renewed, albeit desperate, purpose, Hercules changed his stance. This was no longer a solo performance of brute strength. It was a duet, a deadly coordinated effort. Iolaus, grabbing a torch and a lit brazier from their chariot, became an extension of the hero himself. The plan was terrifying in its simplicity. For it to work, Iolaus would have to leave the safety of the chariot and enter the heart of the battle, to stand shoulder to shoulder with his uncle in the shadow of the beast. Hercules lunged forward, not with the wild abandon of before, but with a focused tactical precision. His blade flashed, a silver arc in the gloom, and a head flew from its shoulders. But this time he didn't recoil to defend. He held his ground, creating a shield with his own body, protecting the opening. In that fleeting instant, Iolaus surged forward. He thrust the blazing torch deep into the gushing, bubbling wound. The sound was like nothing else on earth. A deafening sizzle, a scream of steam and vaporized ichor. The stench of burnt flesh and monstrous blood filled the air, acrid and suffocating. The Hydra thrashed in agony, a pain it had never known. Its power of regeneration, its very essence, was being met with an absolute negation. Where the fire touched, life could not spring forth. The wound was cauterized, blackened, sealed shut. And for the first time in the fight, a severed neck remained just that. A stump. No new heads appeared. A flicker of hope, brighter than any torch, ignited in Hercules' chest. It worked. The biological paradox had a solution. The nightmare had a weakness. He bellowed, a sound of triumph and fury, and the dance began in earnest. Hercules would strike, a blur of muscle and bronze. He would sever a head, 2 heads at a time. And like his shadow, Iolaus would follow, plunging the cleansing fire onto the wound, searing the flesh, stopping the unnatural life before it could begin. They were a machine of destruction, a perfect synthesis of strength and strategy. The hero's might created the opportunity. The strategist's fire secured the victory. Head after head fell. The writhing mass of serpents began to thin. The Hydra, once an indomitable, ever-growing force of nature, was being systematically dismantled. It shrieked, its remaining head striking with frantic desperation. It knew it was dying. It could feel its incredible power being choked off, one cauterized neck at a time. It lunged, it bit, it sprayed its venom, but the 2 men worked as one, anticipating each other's movements, a whirlwind of sword and flame. Finally, only one head remained. But this head was different. It was the original head, the one from which all others had sprung. While the others were a sickly green and brown, this one shone with a faint, unholy golden light. It was larger, its eyes burned with ancient malevolence, and it hissed with an authority the others had lacked. Hercules swung his sword, the same blade that had cleaved through dozens of its brethren, and struck the golden neck with all his might. The blade connected with a deafening clang, as if striking solid metal. Sparks flew, and his sword was thrown from his grasp, his arms vibrating from the shock. The head was completely unharmed. He tried again with his club, the mighty olive wood weapon that had crushed skulls and shattered bones. He brought it down with the force that could level a building. The sound was a sickening thud, but the golden neck didn't break. The head snapped at him unfazed, its fangs dripping with a venom that looked thicker, deadlier than the rest. They both realized the horrifying truth at the same moment. They had solved the problem of regeneration, only to be faced with a far greater one. This central head, the heart of the Hydra, was immortal, could not be cut, could not be bludgeoned, could not be killed. They had pruned the branches, but the root remained eternal and indestructible. The beast was crippled, but it was not, and could never be, defeated. Hercules stood, disarmed and exhausted, staring into the eyes of a creature that could not die, his hard-won victory turning to ash in his mouth. For a moment, there was only the sound of his own ragged breathing and the triumphant, gurgling hiss of the immortal head. In that swamp, surrounded by the carnage he had wrought, Hercules felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the fetid water soaking his boots. It was the coldness of futility, the chilling realization that some problems are not meant to be solved by strength alone. For every enemy he struck down, 2 more took its place. It was a perfect, hellish equation of despair. A hydra of hopelessness was now growing in his own mind, and he had no sword to cut it down. He had been sent here to complete an impossible task, a labor designed to break him, and for the first time, he felt the cracks forming not in his muscles, but in his spirit. This wasn't a beast of flesh and blood, it was a principle. It was a living, breathing paradox, a nightmare given form. How do you kill an idea? How do you defeat a monster whose very nature is to multiply from its own defeat? The weight of this question pressed down on him harder than any physical burden he had ever carried. He was Hercules, the son of Zeus, the strongest man alive, and he was utterly, completely, and hopelessly stuck. But he was not alone. Watching from the relative safety of the treeline, hidden behind a chariot laden with weapons that were now proving useless, was his nephew Iolaus. He was not a demigod. He possessed no supernatural strength. He was a man, and he was terrified. He had watched the battle unfold with a mixture of awe and horror. He saw the blur of Hercules' club, the flash of his sword, and the terrifying, unnatural explosion of new life from each ghastly wound. But because he was not in the thick of the fight, because he was an observer, he saw something Hercules, in his godlike fury, had missed. He didn't just see the heads growing back. He saw how they grew back. He saw the process. When the sword fell, there was a gush of the creature's venomous black blood, a torrent of ichor that steamed as it hit the swampy ground. He saw the stump of the neck writhe and pulse, the flesh churning like boiling tar. He saw sinew and bone weave themselves into existence out of nothing, fueled by this unholy blood. It was a biological process, a terrifyingly rapid one, but a process nonetheless. And every process, Iolaus reasoned, could be interrupted. He wasn't thinking like a hero. He was thinking like a farmer, a craftsman, a mortal. What stops bleeding? Pressure. What stops infection? Cleansing. What stops life in its most fundamental form? What is the opposite of this wet, swampy, unnatural growth? Fire. The thought struck him not like a lightning bolt from his uncle's divine father, but like a desperate, flickering candle in the suffocating darkness. Fire. It cauterizes, seals, purifies. It turns living tissue into sterile ash. It was an answer. A terrible, brutal, but perfect answer. While Hercules stood frozen in his moment of despair, Iolaus acted. He grabbed a torch from their camp supplies, his hands shaking as he lit it from their small, sputtering fire. The flame seemed fragile, insultingly small against the backdrop of the colossal, regenerating beast. But it was a spark of an idea, and that was more powerful than any sword. He scrambled from his hiding place, shouting his uncle's name. His voice thin and reedy against the monster's hissing. Hercules turned, his eyes glazed over with exhaustion and defeat. He saw his nephew, a boy running toward this maelstrom of death with a single pathetic torch. His first instinct was to roar at him to go back, to save himself. But then he saw the look in Iolaus' eyes. It wasn't the look of a fool rushing to his death. It was the look of a man who had seen a path through the maze. Iolaus screamed his idea, the words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. The blood. The wound. We have to burn it. Stop the growth at the source. It was insane. It was desperate. But it was also the only new idea they had. A flicker of hope returned to Hercules' chest, chasing away the cold dread. He looked from his nephew's determined face to the seething mass of serpents before him. He had been fighting the monster's strength. It was time to fight its nature. He nodded, a single sharp gesture. A new strategy was born not from the mind of a god, but from the observation of a man. The battle that followed was no longer a simple contest of brute force. It became a grim ballet, a synchronized dance of death and fire. Hercules, his spirit renewed, let out a roar that challenged the heavens and charged back into the fray. His sword became a blur once more, but this time its purpose was different. It wasn't just to destroy, but to create an opportunity. He swung the blade, a great silver arc that lopped off one of the writhing heads. The head fell, splashing into the muck. The stump gushed its vile black blood. But before the unnatural regeneration could even begin, Iolaus was there. He lunged forward, shoving the blazing torch into the open wound. The sound was sickening, a wet, violent sizzle like water thrown on a forge. The Hydra let out a shriek that was entirely new, not a hiss of aggression, but a scream of pure, unadulterated agony. The smell of burning flesh and vaporized venom filled the air, acrid and choking. The churning stump, which moments before would have been birthing two new horrors, was now a blackened, charred crater of inert flesh. The wound was sealed. The magic was broken. They had done it. They had found the secret. A wild grin spread across Hercules' face. He looked at Iolaus, who, despite the heat and the horror, grinned back. They were no longer just uncle and nephew. They were a team, a perfectly functioning machine of destruction. Hercules was the hammer, and Iolaus was the fire that welded the pieces shut. And so the rhythm began. Swing, cut, hiss, lunge, sizzle, scream, over and over. Hercules would isolate ahead, his incredible strength and speed allowing him to get close. His blade would fall, and like his shadow, Iolaus would follow, plunging the torch into the wound, cauterizing it against the monster's unholy vitality. The Hydra, for the first time in its immortal existence, was being diminished. It was being dismantled piece by agonizing piece. The creature began to panic. Its greatest weapon, its very identity, had been turned against it. The endless tide of its own being had been dammed. The remaining heads thrashed wildly, no longer a coordinated assault, but a desperate, flailing defense. They spat venom, they snapped their jaws, but the duo was relentless. They moved with a shared purpose, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Hercules would block a snapping jaw with his arm, wrapped in the impenetrable Nemean lion's skin, while cleaving the neck of another. Iolaus, ducking and weaving, would follow through with the fire. 7 heads. 6. 5. The once mighty thicket of serpentine necks was thinning. The swamp was filled with the stench of its cauterized stumps. Each sealed wound was a victory, a testament to the fusion of divine strength and mortal ingenuity. 4. 3. 2. The monster was a shadow of its former self, a crippled behemoth whose core advantage was gone. Finally, only one of the mortal heads remained, hissing and spitting alongside the central, golden head of the Immortal. With a final triumphant roar, Hercules swung his sword one last time. The blade sliced clean through the last mortal neck. Iolaus was there in a heartbeat, his torch plunging into the wound, sealing it forever. And then silence. The thrashing stopped. The frantic hissing of dozens of throats died away. Hercules and Iolaus stood panting, covered in mud and black blood, the smoke from the torch curling into the still, swampy air. They had done it. They had defeated the regenerating horror. The beast was neutered, its terrible power nullified. But as the smoke cleared, they saw it. The one that started it all. The golden head. It remained untarnished and unharmed, its ruby eyes glowing with an ancient, undying hatred. It could no longer summon its brethren, but it could not be killed. It was eternal. They had won the battle, but the war's ultimate objective remained, staring right at them, a final indestructible piece of an impossible puzzle. The Immortal had hissed, its golden eyes burning with a cold, undiminished fire. It was a focal point of pure malice, a living trophy of their incomplete victory. Every other neck was a cauterized stump, the colossal body a mountain of cooling flesh, the giant crab a shattered ruin. But this one head, the first and the last, remained. It was a testament to the futility of their struggle, a sneering reptilian monument to their own inadequacy. Strength had reached its limit. Fire had found its master. What was left? For a long moment, Heracles and Iolaus simply stood there, chests heaving, bodies slick with sweat and black blood. The air was thick with the stench of scorched flesh and swamp decay. The silence that followed the cacophony of battle was somehow heavier, more oppressive. In that silence, the only sound was the soft, menacing hiss of the Unkillable. This wasn't the triumphant aftermath of a battle won. It was the agonizing pause of a problem unsolved. How do you defeat that which cannot die? You can't outlast it. You can't overwhelm it. It is a fundamental rule of the cosmos, and it was staring them in the face. Heracles, the son of Zeus, the demigod whose entire existence was defined by overcoming the impossible, was confronted with an absolute. His muscles, which could redirect rivers and strangle lions, were useless. His will, which had driven him through fire and fear, had no purchase here. He felt a rage building within him, but it was a different kind of rage. Not the hot, explosive fury of combat, but a cold, grinding frustration. It was the rage of a master craftsman facing a material that will not yield. The fury of a mind encountering a question with no answer. He could smash it with his club for 1,000 years, and it would simply stare back, its hatred as eternal as its life. He looked at the ground beneath his feet, the soft, muddy earth of the Lernaean swamp. This place had been the monster's sanctuary, its source of power. The very ground was soaked in its poison and its history. And in that moment, staring at the mud and the mire, a new thought began to form, a concept that existed outside the simple binary of life and death. If you cannot extinguish a flame, you must starve it of air. If you cannot destroy an enemy, you must imprison it. The world was full of prisons far older and stronger than any man could build. The earth itself could be a cage. The idea was radical. It was not about victory in the traditional sense. It was not about domination or destruction. It was about containment. It was an admission of defeat on one level, an acceptance that he, Hercules, could not end this creature's existence, but it was the only path to victory on another. He would not kill the Hydra's immortal head. He would entomb it. He would condemn it to an eternity of silent, sightless, impotent rage, buried so deep that its poison could never again touch the world of the living. He turned to Iolaus, his eyes alight with this new desperate strategy. There was no need for a long explanation. The plan was born of the moment, simple and brutal. First, they had to separate the head from the now dead body. This was a task fraught with peril. The body was inert, but the head was as venomous and deadly as ever. Its fangs dripped with a poison so potent that even its breath was said to be lethal. One wrong move, one slip of the hand, and the hero's journey would end right there, in the stinking mud of Lerna. With his bronze sword, the very same one that had lopped off the other 8 heads, Hercules approached the monster one last time. Iolaus stood ready, his torch casting long dancing shadows. The immortal head watched Hercules come, its neck twisting, coiling like a serpent ready to strike. It knew what was happening. There was an intelligence in those golden eyes, an ancient cunning that understood this was the final gambit. It lunged, fangs bared, a spray of black venom arcing through the air. Hercules threw himself aside, the poison sizzling where it hit the ground, turning the mud into a foul, steaming paste. He couldn't fight it head-on. He had to be faster. He circled the twitching neck, waiting for his opening. The head snapped and hissed, a whirlwind of deadly motion. Then, for a fraction of a second, it overextended in a lunge. That was the moment. Hercules surged forward, not with the wild abandon of before, but with the focused precision of a surgeon. He brought the sword down in a gleaming arc, not on the scaled hide, but on the vertebrae connecting the immortal head to the dead body. There was a sickening crunch of bone and sinew. The head was severed, but it did not die. It fell to the ground, landing in the mud with a wet thud, and immediately began to writhe and snap, a disembodied engine of pure hatred. It was even more horrifying now. A thing of nightmare, alive and aware but disconnected from all else. They had to move quickly. Using his immense strength, Hercules found the edge of a massive flat rock, half buried in the swamp. He strained, muscles bunching like cords of rope, and levered it up, creating a shallow pit beneath it. Iolaus, using the long handle of his torch, carefully, painstakingly, prodded and pushed the still snapping head into the depression. It fought him the entire way, its fangs gouging deep furrows in the wood, its hissing a constant, furious shriek. Once the head was in the hole, Hercules put his shoulder to the great rock. With a final, earth-shaking groan of effort, he heaved it over, letting it fall. The impact shook the ground. A muffled hiss and then silence. A profound, absolute silence. The Serpent of Lerna was gone. Its body would rot, but its immortal heart, its central consciousness, was now trapped beneath tons of unyielding stone, buried alive by the sacred road that led from Lerna to Iolaus. It would spend eternity in the suffocating darkness, a prisoner of the very earth it had once terrorized. The labor was done. The second great task was complete, but Hercules wasn't finished. He stood there, breathing heavily, and looked at the vast, dead corpse. He saw the black blood, the ichor of the gods, pooling in the mud, and he recognized it for what it was. Not just the remains of a monster, but a resource. A weapon. The Hydra's venom was the most lethal substance known to man or god. A single drop was enough to bring agonizing death. A poison for which there was no antidote, no cure, no prayer that could save you. Victory had granted him an opportunity. With methodical purpose, Hercules took his quiver and carefully, one by one, dipped the tip of each of his arrows into the Hydra's black, venomous gall. He was careful not to let a single drop touch his skin. As he worked, he transformed his own weapons. They were no longer simple arrows of wood and bronze. They were now instruments of absolute fatality. Any creature pierced by one of these tips was doomed. It was a terrifying power to wield. He had destroyed the monster, but in doing so, he had absorbed its most deadly aspect. He was taking its poison out of the swamp and carrying it with him into the wider world. This act would define the rest of his legend. These poisoned arrows would be his signature, the tools that would help him complete future labors, slaying the Stymphalian birds and the giant Geryon. But they would also become a source of tragedy, accidentally killing his wise teacher, the centaur Chiron, and ultimately playing a role in his own agonizing demise. In defeating the Hydra, Hercules had armed himself with a power that guaranteed victory, but it was a victory that would forever be tainted by the promise of an agonizing, inescapable death. He had won, but he now carried the monster's curse on the tip of every arrow he possessed. For Hercules, this was a profound and terrifying transformation. Every hunt, every battle from this moment forward would be fundamentally different. He was no longer just a man of impossible strength. He was a walking vessel of divine contagion, a bringer of a fate worse than a simple death. The venom didn't just kill, it annihilated. It was a poison that attacked the very soul, a liquid agony that promised no peace, not even in the afterlife. And this terrible power, born from the swampy rot of Lerna, was now his to wield. The question that must have haunted his every waking moment was not if he would use it, but when and against whom. His very next labor seemed designed to test this newfound restraint. Eurystheus, in his cunning cruelty, didn't send him after another beast to be slain. He sent him to capture the Lernaean Hydra, a creature so swift it was said to outrun an arrow in flight. But this was no monster. The hind was a sacred animal, a living treasure belonging to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. It had horns of pure gold and hooves of bronze, and it roamed the hills of Serenia, a shimmering vision of divine grace. To harm it, to spill even a single drop of its sacred blood, would be to invoke the wrath of an Olympian. And so Hercules' poisoned arrows, his ultimate weapons, were utterly useless. He couldn't risk a stray shot. He couldn't risk grazing the creature and condemning it to an eternity of torment, enraging a powerful goddess in the process. The Hydra's curse had already limited him. This labor was not a test of strength, but of patience and endurance. For an entire year, a full calendar of seasons, Hercules pursued the hind. He chased it across Greece, through forests and over mountains, a relentless year-long marathon. He matched its divine stamina with his own demigod persistence, a silent, grinding pursuit that pushed him to the very edge of his limits. Finally, exhausted, the hind sought refuge by the river Ladon, and only then was Hercules able to carefully ensnare it, lifting the sacred, breathing creature onto his shoulders without causing it harm. He had succeeded not with his new, terrible power, but in spite of it. The labor that followed presented a similar challenge. The Erymanthian boar, a gigantic tusked terror that ravaged the countryside of Arcadia. Again, the order was not to kill, but to capture. Hercules chased the beast up the slopes of a snow-covered mountain, driving it into a deep snowdrift where its massive weight and short legs became a liability. Trapped and exhausted in the thick snow, the boar was easily subdued and carried back, squealing and struggling, to the court of Eurystheus. Twice in a row Hercules had been forced to rely on his wits, his speed, and his stamina. The poisoned arrows remained in their quiver, a silent, waiting threat. But their time was coming. It was during his journey back from the hunt for the boar that fate intervened. Seeking shelter, Hercules came upon Mount Pholus, the home of the centaurs, creatures half man, half horse, known for their wild, untamed, and often violent nature. He was welcomed by one, a centaur named Pholus, who was unique in his civility. As a gesture of hospitality, Pholus opened a special cask of wine, a vintage sacred to all centaurs, a gift from the god Dionysus himself. The aroma that drifted from that cask was supernatural. It was so potent, so intoxicatingly divine, that it carried on the wind and reached the nostrils of the other centaurs living in the surrounding caves. Enraged that their sacred wine was being opened for a stranger, they descended on Pholus's cave in a drunken, violent mob. Armed with uprooted trees and massive rocks, they stormed the entrance, their eyes wild with fury. Hercules, defending his host and himself, was forced into battle. He fought them back, first with his bare hands and his club, but he was vastly outnumbered. The centaurs were a tide of chaotic violence. Pushed into a corner, His hand finally went to his quiver. He drew an arrow. An arrow dipped in the blood of the Lernaean Hydra. He fired into the charging crowd. The first centaur struck by an arrow didn't just fall. He screamed. It was a sound unlike any Hercules had ever heard from a dying creature. It was a shriek of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound of a soul being torn apart. The centaur writhed on the ground, his powerful equine body convulsing as the venom coursed through his veins, dissolving him from the inside out. Hercules fired again and again. Each arrow that found its mark brought another of the creatures down in a horrifying display of suffering. The remaining centaurs, seeing the unspeakable fate of their comrades, broke and fled in terror. They scattered across the mountainside, a trail of death and misery in their wake. Hercules gave chase, picking them off one by one. But in the chaos of the battle, a single stray arrow flew past its intended target and found another. It sank deep into the knee of a centaur who had not been part of the drunken mob, a centaur who had merely come to see what the commotion was. This was no ordinary centaur. This was Chiron, the wisest, noblest, and most famous of all his kind. Chiron was not like the others. He was a son of the Titan Cronus, and unlike his brethren, he was immortal. He was a master of medicine, music, and prophecy. He was the personal tutor to Greece's greatest heroes, to Achilles, to Jason, to Asclepius. He was a beacon of wisdom and civilization in a world of chaos. And he was Hercules' friend. The hero rushed to his side, his heart filled with a cold dread. He pulled the arrow from Chiron's knee, horrified at what he had done. Chiron, the master healer who could cure any ailment, looked at the wound and knew. He knew the origin of the poison. He could feel the Hydra's ancient evil beginning its work, a cold fire spreading through his immortal veins. And here the true diabolical nature of the Hydra's curse was finally revealed. The venom was designed to inflict an agonizing death. But Chiron could not die. He was immortal. The unstoppable force of the Hydra's poison had met the immovable object of Chiron's eternal life. The result was not a negation. It was an equation for eternal suffering. The poison could not kill him, but the pain was absolute. It was a torment that eclipsed any physical injury, a constant searing agony that would never ever fade. The greatest healer in the world was afflicted with a wound he could not heal, a pain he could not numb, a curse he could not lift. His immortality had become his hell. For days, for weeks, for years Chiron suffered. His unending life was now an unending torture chamber. The great teacher's lessons were replaced by ceaseless groans of pain. His wisdom was drowned out by a sea of misery from which there was no escape. His suffering was so immense, so profound, that it moved the gods themselves to pity. Finally, Chiron could bear it no longer. He made a plea to Zeus. He begged for an end. He, the immortal, wished for the one thing he could never have, the simple peace of death. In an unprecedented act of divine mercy, a deal was struck. His immortality would be given away, traded to release another from eternal torment. The Titan Prometheus, who was chained to a rock for giving fire to humanity. Chiron willingly sacrificed his eternal life, not for glory, not for power, but simply for the sweet, merciful release of oblivion. He chose to die just to make the pain stop. And so the great Chiron, mentor to heroes, passed from the world. He wasn't killed by a monster in a great battle. He was brought down by a tragic accident, a friendly fire casualty of a hero's cursed weapon. The Hydra, long dead and buried under a rock in the swamps of Lerna, had reached out with its venomous phantom hand and claimed the noblest of the centaurs. Its physical heads were gone, but its poisonous legacy was just beginning to unfold, proving that the monster's true power was not in its ability to regenerate, but in its unending capacity to inflict suffering, long after its own heart had stopped beating. This victory was not clean. It was a brutal, cauterized amputation, leaving behind a phantom limb that would ache for eternity. Hercules, slick with sweat and black ichor, stood over the smoldering, headless carcass. He looked at the grotesque mound of flesh, a monument to his strength and Iolaus' quick thinking. But his eyes were drawn to the fluid that still oozed from the cauterized stumps and pooled around the beast's immortal heart. It was a vile concoction, a shimmering greenish-black venom that seemed to hiss as it met the air. This was the Hydra's gall, its blood, its very soul distilled into a liquid essence of pure, agonizing death. And in that moment, standing at the precipice of his great victory, Hercules made a decision. a decision that would echo through the rest of his life, turning triumphs into tragedies and staining his legend with an indelible darkness. He saw not just the remains of a monster but a resource, an unparalleled power waiting to be harnessed. He looked at his own arrows, simple tools of wood and flint, and then back at the liquid damnation seeping into the Lernaean soil. He was a hero, a force for order, but the world was filled with monsters far more cunning and resilient than the Hydra. He needed an edge. He needed a weapon that carried the same finality as the abyss itself. Slowly, deliberately, he unslung his quiver. One by one, he took out his arrows, and with a grim reverence, he dipped their tips into the Hydra's venomous gore. The poison coated the flint heads, clinging to them like a second skin, a dark anointing. This was more than just practicality, it was a transgression. He was taking a piece of the primordial chaos he had been sent to destroy and making it his own. He was wedding his purpose to the monster's power, binding his destiny to its corrupting legacy. Each arrow he treated became a vessel of absolute death. A single scratch would be enough. The poison was not like any other. It was a creeping, necrotizing plague that attacked the victim from the inside out, dissolving flesh and bone, bringing a torment so profound that death was a merciful release. There was no antidote, no cure, no prayer that could turn it back. He was forging the perfect weapon, but he was also embracing a terrible new philosophy, that to defeat the darkness, one must be willing to wield it. He didn't realize, not yet, that such power never comes without a price. The venom did not distinguish between friend and foe, between monster and man, between intention and accident. It was an absolute, and it demanded absolute consequences. He had taken the Hydra's most terrifying weapon, its ability to inflict unending suffering, and made it portable. He had packed a monster into his quiver. The first hint of this dreadful cost would come not in a battle against some fearsome beast, but in a moment of chaos and misunderstanding. Years later, during a conflict with a band of centaurs, Hercules let his poisoned arrows fly. In the heat of the fray, one of these arrows, loosed with heroic intent, went astray. It found its mark not in a rampaging enemy, but in the knee of an old friend who had come to mediate, the wise and gentle centaur Chiron. Chiron was no ordinary creature. He was the son of a Titan, an immortal being who had taught heroes and kings, a master of medicine, music, and prophecy. He was a beacon of wisdom in a savage world. And now, a sliver of the Hydra's curse was buried in his flesh. The poison went to work immediately, a fire racing through his veins, an agony beyond comprehension. But here was the cruelest twist of fate, the ultimate horror of the Hydra's legacy. Chiron could not die. His immortality, once a divine gift, became his eternal torture chamber. He was trapped in a body that was perpetually being destroyed but could never perish. The wound would not heal, the pain would not cease, and the sweet relief of death was forever denied to him. He writhed in unending torment, a living testament to the collateral damage of Hercules' power. The great hero, his friend, could only watch in horror, his victory over the Hydra now the source of his beloved mentor's damnation. This was the true nature of the poison he now carried. It did not just kill, it created paradoxes of suffering, it turned blessings into curses, and it inflicted wounds that time itself could not mend. Chiron's agony was a mirror reflecting the choice Hercules had made in the swamp, a choice to fight evil with a greater, more insidious evil. But the corruption wasn't confined to the tips of his arrows. Back in Lerna, the consequences of the battle were sinking into the earth itself. The Hydra's venom-laced blood had saturated the ground, poisoning the water table. The great swamp, once a place of menacing but vibrant life, began to change. The reeds turned black and withered. The water became stagnant and foul, a shimmering, oily soup from which no creature could drink and survive. The very air grew heavy with a toxic miasma, a perpetual fog that smelled of decay and despair. Fishermen and farmers who lived on the swamp's edge found their livestock sickening, their crops failing, their children born with strange afflictions. Hercules' battle hadn't cleansed the land. It had consecrated it to the memory of the monster. He had created a permanent dead zone, a geographical scar that would forever bear witness to the Hydra's power. The locals learned to shun the place, whispering that the ghost of the Hydra still haunted the fetid waters, its venomous breath rising with the morning mist. They were right, in a way. The physical monster was gone, but its essence remained, infused into the very ecosystem. It was a blight that could not be burned away or buried. It had become part of the world. So as Hercules walked away from Lerna, he was a changed man, carrying a changed arsenal. He believed he was better equipped to face the horrors of the world, armed with a power that could lay any monster low. He did not yet understand that he hadn't truly left the Hydra behind. He carried its most potent part with him, a creeping corruption that would follow him for the rest of his days, turning his strength into a liability and his heroism into a source of unspeakable tragedy. He had won the battle, but the monster's poison was now flowing in the veins of the world, and one day, it would find its way back to him. The serpent was dead, but its venom had just begun its journey. For years it seemed the prophecy was a lie. The venom's journey appeared to be a slow one, meandering through the world but never touching its intended target. Hercules, the man who had stared into the abyss and won, moved on. He had other labors to complete, other monsters to slay, a penance to finish. He wrestled the Cretan bull into submission, he tamed the man-eating maras of Diomedes, and he traveled to the edge of the world to steal the golden apples of the Hesperides. With each victory his legend grew, and the memory of the Lernaean swamp, of the hissing heads and the cauterizing fire, faded into just one chapter in an epic life. He was no longer just a man seeking atonement. He was the savior of civilization, the strong arm that mortals and even gods relied upon when chaos threatened to overwhelm order. He was Hercules, the greatest hero the world had ever known, and when his labors were finally complete, he found something he hadn't realized he was looking for. A future. He found love. Her name was Diana, a princess beautiful and fierce, whom he had won by wrestling a river god. With her he built a life, had children, and for the first time tasted a peace he had never known. The world was safe. His family was safe. The Hydra was a ghost, a story to tell his children, a testament to his strength. The venom, that potent cocktail of Serpent's rage and immortal poison, was now just a useful tool, coating the tips of his arrows, ensuring that no monster would ever threaten his newfound peace again. He had tamed the Hydra's power, made it his own. He was in control. But the venom had a memory. It remembered its source. It remembered the searing pain of Iolaus' torch. And it remembered the man who had wielded it. It was patient. It flowed not through rivers or streams, but through the veins of fate itself, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, not at the body of Hercules, but at the very heart of his happiness. That moment came on a journey, with his new wife Diana by his side. They reached the river Ivinus, a raging torrent too swift and deep to cross. There they met a centaur named Nessus, a creature of immense power, half man, half horse. He presented himself as a humble ferryman, offering to carry the delicate Diana across the violent waters while Hercules, in his immense strength, could simply swim. Hercules, seeing the logic and trusting the gesture, agreed. He handed his precious wife over to the centaur and plunged into the river. But Nessus was no humble servant. The moment Hercules was in the middle of the current, distracted by the fight against the rapids, the centaur's true nature revealed itself. He was a creature of base impulse, of violent desire. He spun around and instead of heading for the far bank, galloped away, attempting to abduct and assault Diana right there in the wilderness. Hercules heard his wife scream over the roar of the water. He burst from the river, his eyes blazing with the righteous fury that had leveled armies and terrified gods. He didn't hesitate. He reached for his bow, for the arrows he had dipped in the Hydra's blood so long ago. He drew the string, took aim, and with the legendary skill that never missed, he let the shaft fly. The arrow soared across the river and struck Nessus square in the back, piercing his heart. The centaur roared in agony, a sound that was half horse and half man, and collapsed to the ground, Diana falling with him. The poison of the Hydra, a substance so virulent it could kill immortals, went to work instantly. It was a fire in the blood, an acid that dissolved life from the inside out. Nessus knew he was dead. He had mere seconds before the venom consumed him entirely. But in those seconds his mind, twisted with hatred and a desire for revenge, worked with lightning speed. He saw his chance, not just to die, but to plant a seed of destruction that would bloom long after he was gone. As Diana scrambled away from him, he called out to her, his voice raspy, choked with his own poisoned blood. He played not the villain but the victim. He begged her to come closer, whispering that he wanted to give her a gift, an apology for his transgression, a final act to make amends. He knew Hercules was still crossing the river, too far away to hear. He was speaking only to her. He told her that his blood, now mixing with the legendary poison of the Hydra, had been transformed. It was no longer just blood, but a potent love charm, a filter of immense power. He lied with the conviction of a dying god. He told her to gather his blood, to soak a piece of cloth in it. He whispered that if the day ever came that Hercules' love for her began to fade, if his eyes ever wandered to another woman, she should anoint one of his tunics with this mixture. The charm, he promised, would not harm him, but would ensure that his heart would be bound to her, and only her, forever. It was the ultimate weapon against infidelity, a guarantee of eternal love, a gift from a dying creature who only wanted to see her happy. It was a masterful deception, preying on the deepest insecurities of any mortal in love with the demigod. Hercules was famous, desired by countless women. The fear that she might one day lose him was a real and terrifying possibility. In that moment of terror, confusion, and relief, Diana believed him. She saw a chance to secure her happiness for all time. While Hercules was still making his way to the shore, she quickly and secretly collected the centaur's blood, a dark, viscous mixture of life, lust, and the Hydra's immortal venom. She concealed the vile concoction and never spoke a word of it to her husband. It was her secret, her insurance policy against a broken heart. Years passed. Many years. The incident with Nessus, like the battle with the Hydra, faded into memory. Hercules and Diana's family grew. They were happy. The vial of poisoned blood lay hidden, forgotten in a dark chest. The venom was dormant once more, waiting. Hercules continued his adventures, his fame undiminished. He was a hero, but he was also a man of his time, a man of immense appetites. And his eyes did eventually begin to wander. His final campaign was against the city of Icalia. After sacking the city, he took its princess, the beautiful young Iolaus, as his captive. Rumors, carried on the wind like sparks from a fire, reached Diana's ears long before Hercules returned home. They said he wasn't just bringing back a captive, he was bringing back a new love, a younger woman to replace her. The old fear, the one Nessus had so expertly identified and armed, awoke from its long slumber. The insecurity that had been a tiny seed was now a monstrous, thorny vine, wrapping itself around her heart. She remembered the centaur's dying words. She remembered his gift. In her mind, twisted by jealousy and the terror of abandonment, it wasn't a dark and forbidden magic. It was her only hope. It was the key to restoring her family, to reclaiming the love she felt slipping through her fingers. She retrieved the vial from its hiding place. The dark liquid seemed to pulse in the low light, a promise of eternal devotion. As Hercules prepared to return home a victor, sending a messenger ahead to request a clean tunic to wear for his triumphal sacrifice to the gods, Diana saw her chance. This was the moment. With trembling hands, she uncorked the vial and began to carefully, lovingly, anoint the finest robe she could find, preparing a welcome home gift for her husband, unaware she was not weaving a love spell, but stitching the final, agonizing chapter of his life. The hero's return was everything a nation could hope for. Hercules, son of Zeus, victor of Icalia, strode home not just as a conqueror, but as a living legend whose footsteps shook the earth. Messengers had run ahead, their voices hoarse with tales of his triumph, and the entire city of Trachis had emptied into the streets to welcome him. As he approached, a great sacrifice was prepared. Lycus, his most trusted herald, was sent ahead to the palace to retrieve a fitting garment for Hercules to wear as he offered thanks to his father Zeus. Diana, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, saw her moment arrive. This was it, the perfect occasion, a public sacrifice, a display of piety and power, where Hercules would stand before gods and men. She presented Lycus with the robe she had so carefully prepared. A magnificent garment, woven with threads of gold, now secretly imbued with the promise of eternal devotion. She handed it over, a prayer on her lips, her mind filled with visions of a renewed love, of Iolaus' beauty fading from her husband's mind. Lycus, knowing nothing of the vial or the centaur, accepted the gift and rushed back to his master. Hercules stood before the sacrificial altar, the fires burning high. He was at the apex of his glory, his body a testament to a life of impossible labors, his name a synonym for strength itself. He took the robe from Lycus and, with a smile of gratitude for his wife's thoughtful gift, he drew it over his colossal shoulders. For a moment all was well. The fabric felt soft, the craftsmanship exquisite. He turned to the altar, raising his hands to the heavens to begin the rites. And then the heat of the sacrificial flames touched him. It was not the fire on the altar that began to burn. It was the fire on his skin. A strange, searing heat blossomed across his back and shoulders, as if the robe itself was smoldering. He flinched, a flicker of confusion on his face. But this was no simple ember. The heat intensified with terrifying speed, escalating from a hot sting to an unbearable, acidic fire. The love charm of Nessus, the venom of the Lernaean Hydra, had been dormant, but the warmth had awakened it. It was alive. The Hydra's blood, mixed with the centaur's, began to work its monstrous chemistry. The magnificent robe started to bubble and hiss, melting like wax and fusing to the hero's skin. A scream unlike any sound ever heard from Hercules tore from his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that silenced the cheering crowd and sent a tremor of fear through the very stones of the city. He clawed at the garment, trying to rip it away, but it was no longer a robe. It had become a second skin, a clinging shroud of liquid fire. Where he tore at the fabric, he tore away his own flesh, ripping muscle from bone. The venom, now in his bloodstream, coursed through him like molten lead, a relentless, unholy torment that attacked his very essence. This was a pain beyond the comprehension of mortals. He had been mauled by the Nemean lion, gored by the Erymanthian boar, and had held the weight of the heavens on his shoulders, but none of it compared to this. This was an agony designed by a primordial monster, perfected by a centaur's hate, and delivered by the hand of love. In his delirium of pain, he roared out, demanding to know who had done this to him. The terrified herald Lycus stammered that the robe was a gift from his wife Deianira. A new fire, the fire of betrayal, ignited in Hercules' eyes, eclipsing even the physical torment. Deianira, his wife. He seized the trembling Lycus by the foot, his mind shattered by pain and rage. He began to swing him around his head, faster and faster, a horrifying display of his remaining godlike strength, until he released the herald, hurling his broken body into the distant sea. The crowd scattered in terror. The hero, their savior, had become a screaming, burning monster. He thrashed and roared, uprooting ancient olive trees with his bare hands and smashing boulders against the mountainside, his bellows of pain echoing through the valleys like thunder from a clear sky. Back at the palace, Deianira had been watching. She saw a tuft of wool she had used to apply the potion, which she had carelessly tossed onto the flagstones. In the growing heat of the day, it had begun to smoke and disintegrate, bubbling away into nothing. A cold dread, far worse than any jealousy she had ever felt, seized her. She understood. She understood the centaur's lie, the true nature of his final venomous gift. And as the distant, inhuman screams of her husband reached her ears, her world collapsed. The love spell was a death sentence. The potion to win back his heart was a poison designed to tear him apart. Overcome with a guilt so profound it extinguished her very soul, she fled into the palace. She had sought to bind her husband to her with a thread of magic, and instead, she had wrapped him in a shroud of unimaginable suffering. There was no apology, no explanation that could ever undo this horror. There was only one path left. She found her husband's sword, the one that had slain so many monsters, and in the silence of her chambers, she fell upon it, ending the life that had just ended the greatest hero the world had ever known. Hercules, his rampage of agony finally exhausting him, was carried on a litter to Mount Oeta. The Hydra's poison was relentless, but it could not kill him. He was the son of Zeus. His divine blood granted him immortality, but it was a curse, not a gift. It meant the pain would never end. He was trapped, a god in a mortal's body burning for eternity. Lying there, his legendary physique reduced to a charred and smoking ruin, he made his final decision. If he could not die, he would be unmade. He commanded his son, Iolaus, to build a great funeral pyre. He would offer his body to the flames, hoping that a mortal fire could cleanse him of the immortal poison. Iolaus, weeping, obeyed his father's last command. He and Hercules' companions built a massive pyre of oak. They gently lifted the tormented hero and laid him upon the logs. Hercules, in his final moments of clarity, lay his head down upon his club and spread the skin of the Nemean lion over himself like a blanket, composing himself for his end with the same courage he had shown in all his labors. He looked at his son, at his loyal friends, and ordered them to light the fire. But no one moved. Their hands trembled. Their hearts refused. How could they? How could any man set a torch to the living body of Hercules, their leader, their protector, their friend? They stood frozen, tears streaming down their faces, unable to fulfill this last terrible request. Hercules pleaded, his voice a raw rasp, begging them for the mercy of oblivion. Still they could not. The pyre remained unlit, a monument to their love and their despair. It seemed the hero was doomed to suffer forever, until a lone figure was seen approaching through the trees. It was a shepherd drawn by the commotion, a man named Philoctetes. He saw the great hero laid upon the pyre, heard his pleas for release, and understood. Hercules looked at him, his eyes filled with a world of pain, and made him an offer. Light the pyre, and his legendary bow and arrows, the very arrows dipped in the Hydra's venom, would be his. Philoctetes, a young shepherd, a mere mortal standing before a demigod in his final agony, looked from the hero's tormented face to the unlit pyre. He saw not a transaction but a sacred trust. He was being asked to perform the ultimate act of mercy, and in return he would become the custodian of a power that had shaped the world. He would carry the legacy of Hercules, and with it, the lingering poison of the Lernaean Hydra. He nodded, his decision made. He took the torch. As the flames licked the wood, then roared to life, engulfing the greatest hero the world had ever known. A great thunderclap split the sky. Zeus, his father, was welcoming his son home. The mortal shell of Hercules burned away, but his spirit, his divine essence, was drawn up to the heavens to take its place among the gods on Mount Olympus. Philoctetes stood alone on Mount Ida, the heat of the pyre on his face, the weight of the monstrous bow in his hand, and the quiver of venom-tipped arrows on his back. He was no longer just a shepherd. He was the inheritor of a legend. The power he now wielded was absolute. An arrow loosed from this bow could fell any beast, pierce any armor, and deliver a death from which there was no recovery. The Hydra's ichor, tamed by Hercules, was now his to command. For years he carried this burden and this gift with honor. He became a hero in his own right, his name whispered in the same breath as the champions of his age. So when Helen, the queen of Sparta, was abducted and taken to the impregnable city of Troy, it was only natural that Philoctetes and his divine weapons would be called to join the Achaean fleet. He swore the same oath as all the other kings and heroes of Greece, to bring Helen home or to die on the shores of Troy. He sailed with Odysseus, a man known for his cunning, his silver tongue, and his ruthless pragmatism. The fleet was a magnificent sight, 1,000 ships cutting through the Aegean, a coalition of the greatest warriors ever assembled. Their first stop was the island of Chryse, to make a sacrifice to a local deity. As the men disembarked, Philoctetes, ever the proud wielder of his legacy, walked with the great bow of Hercules slung over his shoulder. It was here that the Hydra, long dead and decapitated, stirred from its silent slumber within the venom. It was here the serpent struck back. As Philoctetes walked near the temple, he was bitten on the foot by a common water snake, a painful nuisance for any other man, a wound that would heal in a matter of days. But for Philoctetes it was a catastrophe. In his shock, he dropped one of the hydra-tipped arrows from his quiver. The razor-sharp point, coated in that unholy ichor, pricked the very same wound the snake had made. The venom of the common snake was nothing, but the Hydra's poison, that ancient supernatural agent of decay, now had a gateway. It didn't flood his system and kill him as it did the centaurs. No, the Hydra had a more patient, more cruel fate in mind for the man who dared to wield its essence. The venom mingled with his blood in that one isolated spot. The wound did not heal. It began to fester. The flesh turned black, the smell became putrid, and a pain beyond all description, seized him. It was not the clean pain of a sword cut or a broken bone. It was a gnawing, burning, unending agony that seemed to have a life of its own. It was the pain of being perpetually devoured. He would scream, his cries echoing through the camp, raw and animalistic. They were the cries of a man whose body had become his own personal hell. At first his comrades tried to help. The army's finest healers applied salves and poultices, but the wound only worsened. The venom defied all medicine, all reason. It was a divine curse, and no mortal remedy could touch it. The stench from his foot became so overpowering that men could not eat or sleep near him. His ceaseless, agonizing screams shattered the morale of the army. He was no longer Philoctetes, the proud hero and heir to Hercules. He was a liability, a walking screaming plague. The serpent was achieving what no army could. It was sowing discord and disgust among the Greeks before they even reached Troy. Odysseus, ever the pragmatist, saw the situation clearly. This expedition was the most important military undertaking in history. They could not afford a weakness like this in their ranks. Their focus had to be on Troy, not on the incurable suffering of one man, hero or not. So he, along with the other Greek commanders, made a decision. It was a cold, calculated, and brutal choice. They would abandon him. Under the pretense of seeking a peaceful place for him to recover, they sailed to the nearby island of Lemnos, a desolate, volcanic rock uninhabited by man. They carried the writhing, screaming Philoctetes ashore, and left him in a cave with a small supply of food and water. And as he lay there, delirious with pain, he watched the 1,000 ships of the Achaean fleet, his brothers in arms, raise their sails and disappear over the horizon, leaving him to his fate. The betrayal was a wound deeper than the one on his foot. He had sworn an oath, and they had forsaken him. He was left to die alone on a barren island, his only companions the unending pain and the divine bow that had caused it all. For 10 years Philoctetes endured. 10 long solitary years, while the Trojan War raged on without him. His existence was a paradox of suffering and survival. The festering unholy wound on his foot, a constant source of agony, was the Hydra's curse. But the bow of Hercules, the very instrument of that curse, became his salvation. He learned to hunt from his knees, crawling through the rocks. The arrows, tipped with that same horrific venom, never missed their mark. A single shot could bring down a sea bird from the sky, its life extinguished before it hit the ground. He survived, fueled by a burning hatred for the men who had abandoned him, especially Odysseus. He was a ghost, a forgotten hero trapped in a cycle of pain and survival, his only link to the world the monstrous weapon in his hands. The Hydra hadn't killed him. It had imprisoned him in a living tomb, its venom a constant reminder of its power to corrupt, to isolate, and to destroy. Meanwhile at Troy, the war had ground to a bloody stalemate. The greatest heroes of Greece, Achilles, Ajax, Diomedes, had fought and died. The Trojan walls, said to be built by the gods themselves, remained unbreached. After a decade of fighting, the Greeks were desperate. Their spirits were broken, their resources dwindling. In their despair, they captured a Trojan seer named Helenus, a son of King Priam, and forced him to reveal the secrets to Troy's downfall. He gave them a prophecy, a series of conditions that had to be met for the city to fall. And one of those conditions sent a shockwave of guilt and dread through the Greek command. Troy, the seer declared, could never be taken without the bow and arrows of Hercules, the very weapons they had marooned on a desolate island, in the hands of the man they had betrayed and left for dead 10 years earlier. Their only hope for victory now rested with the forgotten hero, the man whose unending screams still haunted their nightmares. They had to go back. They had to face the man they had wronged and convince him to join their cause. They had to retrieve the power of the Hydra they had so callously thrown away. The journey back to the desolate island of Lemnos was a voyage through a sea of guilt. For 10 long years they had fought and bled on the shores of Troy, all while a man they had sworn an oath with rotted away in exile, his only crime being a wound inflicted by the gods. Odysseus, the architect of the abandonment, felt the familiar cold knot of pragmatism in his gut. It was a necessary evil then, and this return was a necessary penance now. Beside him stood Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, a young man whose heart was still forged in the fires of honor, not yet cooled by the cynicism of a decade-long war. He knew the story only as a grim legend, but now he was sailing toward its living, breathing, and suffering heart. He was to be the bait, his youthful honesty a tool to pry open a wound that had festered for a decade. They found him in a squalid cave, a place that smelled of sickness and despair. Philoctetes was no longer the proud archer who had sailed for Troy. He was a gnarled wreck of a man draped in rags, his face a mask of unending agony. His leg was a horror, swollen and discolored around a wound that wept a foul poison, the lingering curse of the serpent's fang. But in his hands he clutched the source of their quest, the great bow of Hercules. It was a magnificent weapon, seeming to hum with a divine power that stood in stark contrast to the decay surrounding it. When he saw them, his eyes, hollowed by pain and isolation, blazed with a fire that had not been extinguished in 10 years. It was the fire of pure, undiluted hatred. Odysseus, ever the manipulator, let the young Neoptolemus approach first. The boy, true to his nature, spoke with a sincerity that was both genuine and a carefully constructed lie. He told Philoctetes that he too had been wronged by the Greek commanders, that he had fled Troy in disgust and was now on his way home. He offered the lonely man passage, companionship, a return to the world that had cast him out. For a moment, a flicker of hope crossed Philoctetes' tortured face. After a decade of speaking only to the rocks and the waves, the sound of a sympathetic voice was a powerful balm. He saw in Neoptolemus the ghost of his own youth, the reflection of the hero he once was. He began to trust him, even showing him the divine bow, letting him feel the weight of the weapon that had been his only companion. But Odysseus could not let the charade play out. His impatience, his desperate need for the weapon, overrode his cunning. He emerged from the shadows, and the illusion shattered. The flicker of hope in Philoctetes' eyes died, replaced by the raging inferno of betrayal. The screams that followed were not just of physical pain, but of a soul being torn apart for a second time. He cursed them, cursed the Atreides, cursed the entire Greek army. He raised the bow, not to hand it over, but to kill the men who had come to mock his suffering. The mission was a catastrophic failure. Neoptolemus, horrified by the depths of Odysseus' deceit and overwhelmed with pity for the broken man before him, refused to take the bow by force. He was ready to abandon the war, to take Philoctetes home as he had promised, even if it meant the ruin of the Greek cause. All seemed lost. And then the sky itself seemed to part. A figure of impossible light and power descended upon the desolate island, a man whose presence radiated divinity. It was Hercules, ascended to Olympus, now a god. His voice was not a command, but a force of nature, echoing with the authority of fate itself. He spoke to Philoctetes not as a king or a general, but as an old friend. He reminded him of their bond, forged at the hero's own funeral pyre, where Philoctetes' courage had earned him the divine bow. Hercules laid out his destiny. He told him that it was fated for him to go to Troy, that the sons of the healer Asclepius were waiting to cure his wound, and that with his bow, he would not only win immortal glory but bring an end to the endless war. He was to be the city's doom, the final arbiter of its fall. To defy this was to defy the will of Zeus himself. Faced with the command of a god and the promise of his friend, the hatred in Philoctetes' heart finally gave way to purpose. The decade of pain had not been meaningless suffering. It had been a crucible, forging him into the instrument of Troy's destruction. He agreed. He sailed with his former enemies back to the city. He now had a divine mandate to destroy. The Greek healers, as Hercules had promised, tended to his wound. The divine poison was soothed. The agony that had defined his existence for 10 years finally receded, leaving behind a man hardened by pain and singularly focused on his target. He stepped onto the plains of Troy not merely as a soldier, but as an avatar of vengeance. He walked past the Greek lines, a living ghost returned from his grave, the great bow of Hercules gleaming in his hands. He saw him across the battlefield, Paris, the beautiful arrogant prince who had stolen a queen and plunged the world into a decade of slaughter. Philoctetes drew the bowstring back. The wood groaned, humming with the power of a god. He knocked an arrow, its bronze tip darkened by a substance that carried the immortal rage of a long-dead monster. It was the venom of the Lernaean Hydra. He released the string. The arrow flew not like a simple projectile, but like a serpent striking through the air. It found its mark in Paris's flesh. It was not a clean kill. The wound was small, but the poison that entered his veins was absolute. The Hydra's venom knew no cure. It was an ancient and unholy agony, a fire that burned through the blood, turning it to acid. The very essence of the undying monster, a creature of multiplying chaos, was now devouring the Trojan prince from within. Paris, the man whose selfish desires had caused the deaths of tens of thousands, died screaming, his beauty contorting into a mask of horror as he was consumed by a poison born in a swamp years before he was even born. With the death of their champion, the spirit of Troy broke. The prophecy was fulfilled. The city was now vulnerable. Soon after Odysseus's final gambit, the great wooden horse would breach the walls that had stood for generations. Troy burned. The war was over, and it was won in its final decisive moment by the ghost of the Hydra. The venom of its immortal head, a substance of pure destruction, had been preserved, passed from a demigod to a forgotten hero, and delivered as the final fatal blow in the world's greatest war. The Hydra then was more than just a monster in a swamp. It was a terrifying lesson written into the fabric of mythology. It is the symbol of the cascading consequence, the problem that multiplies with every ill-considered attempt to solve it. Its heads represent the branching, unforeseen disasters that spring from a single violent act. Hercules' brute force only made it stronger. It was strategy, cauterization, and the burial of the immortal source that finally contained it. But you can never truly destroy such a thing. Its essence, its poison, lingers. It becomes a tool, a weapon waiting for a new hand, a new war. The story of the Hydra is a chilling reminder that the solutions to our problems can sometimes become far more dangerous than the problems themselves, and that the venom of a battle fought long ago can seep through the soil of history, waiting to poison the future.